All right. Welcome, everybody. This is Galen Barbos, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be sharing some highlights from our recent annual tracking report describing trends in the residential solar adopter income and demographic attributes. I'm joined here with my co-authors, Sydney Forrester, Eric O'Shaughnessy, and Naeem Darguth. You'll be hearing a bit from all of us today. Sydney and I will do a little tag team on the presentation. Eric is going to give a brief demo at the end of the data visualization tool that we've released in conjunction with the report. And then Naeem will be driving the Q&A at the end. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. So first, you'll notice the web address listed on the title slide here, solardemographics.lbl.gov. That is where you can find the report, which looks quite a bit like the presentation that we'll be giving here today. It's a PowerPoint document, as well as the data visualization tool that I mentioned, and other related research that we've done on topics involving solar demographics and income issues. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be posting the webinar recording on that website as well. And then last, before we begin here, just wanted to mention that we will have some time for questions and answers at the end. If you would all be so kind as to enter your questions into the Q&A box as we go, Naeem can then kind of get that stuff queued up, and we'll have it ready to go, and hopefully have maybe 15, 20 minutes or so at the end to go through your questions. So with that, let's get started. And I can see we've already got a chat coming in. Okay, and that's just from Sydney. So here we have just an outline of the report itself. We'll be going through most of this material during the presentation, though a few of these pieces we omitted or scaled back just for brevity's sake. But this basically outlines kind of the full scope of topics. And basically, you'll see that the first half of the report and of the presentation today is going to focus on income-related trends, and then the latter portion will focus on other socioeconomic and demographic characteristics as listed under item number 3 here. Some of you are probably familiar with this report from previous editions, but for those that aren't, essentially this is a descriptive, very much a data-oriented product focused on describing trends in the income and other demographic characteristics of US residential solar photovoltaic adopters. To be clear, our focus here is really on behind the meter residential solar. We don't address community solar. And for the most part, we're really focusing on single family homes. There is a little bit of material that we'll present later looking at multifamily homes, but by and large, we're really focusing on behind the meter, single family rooftop solar. What's new in this latest edition of the report? Of course, we've got an extra year of data. So the trends here go through year end 2020. In addition, this year we incorporated some additional household level data on race, ethnicity, and language preference. And so that allowed us to go a little bit deeper into those trends than we have in years past. As I mentioned, we released this report in conjunction with the data visualization tool that Eric will show later. We also have done a number of more in-depth kind of analytical topical studies. For the most part, this report here is really descriptive, as I mentioned. We'll kind of hint at some hypotheses for the trends that we see, but that's not really the main point of this report. The main point is just to really lay out kind of the foundational data and trends as the basis for kind of deeper analysis in other venues. So just if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, these are kind of the 3 highest level takeaways. First, solar adopters are diverse. It's, you know, although we often talk about them in terms of central tendencies, it's important to keep in mind that there is really a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of income levels and other socioeconomic characteristics here. Compared to the general population, though, solar adopters do, as we'll see, tend to be higher income and also differ in terms of the many other demographic characteristics that we explore. But really across the board, those differences are converging over time, somewhat slowly, I would say, but there is kind of a sustained convergence, as you'll see. So the data from this report comes primarily from a couple different places. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side here, we have a data set consisting of street addresses of residential solar adopters from around the country. That data comes mostly from our annual Tracking the Sun report, but we also bring in data that we purchase from BuildZoom and Ohm Analytics that is culled mostly from building permit records. And so we merge those addresses together, and then all of the demographic and income related data for solar adopters we purchase from Experian. It's all household level data or estimates. And within the report, we provide a little bit more information on kind of how they develop those estimates and what they mean. But it's important to keep in mind that those data are their estimates, but they're at the household level. And then finally, where we compare the characteristics of solar adopters to the population at large, the population at large in this case is really based on data primarily from the census, from the American Community Survey. So that's the data. Here we just provide a little bit of an overview of our data coverage. On the left-hand side, we show our sample size over time. That's the orange bars. The red line shows our sample coverage, so what fraction of all residential PV systems in the US are captured in our sample, and you can see it's pretty consistent at 80% or so over time. The blue line highlights the fraction of our sample that's from California. You can see it's a large fraction, about half, and that's a consistent theme that we'll come back to at various points throughout the presentation. The map on the right-hand side just shows snapshot from 2020, showing the market coverage by state. And you can see, most states we've got pretty decent coverage. The darker colors, particularly in the more active solar markets, though certainly there are some states where our coverage is not nearly as strong. So just a couple of points on kind of the data. So I mentioned that the income estimates, they are based on that they're at the household level. So if there are two income earners within the household, it represents the sum total of those two. The other socioeconomic attributes that we'll be talking about are mostly based on what within the Experian lexicon is called the primary householder, which is typically the male household member. The PV adopter income data and the demographic data, those are based on sort of the Experian consumer view data set as of Q3 2021. So it's not based on the time of adoption. And so it's just important to keep that in mind when we show income trends over time, that those income estimates are refer to income in the year 2021, even if the adoption might have happened at some earlier point in time. And that's just the nature of the data. And then lastly, as I kind of alluded to earlier, because of its large share of our sample, California heavily impacts a lot of the national trends that we'll see, and we try to unpack that where we can. So I'm going to just give some of the higher level income related trends here before handing it over to Sydney. So this figure here just shows the distribution in solar adopter incomes among 2020 adopters. And really the main point here is just that there is, as I mentioned earlier, this wide distribution. It's not a monolithic group in terms of income. The kind of mode of this distribution, as you can see, is in the $50,000 to $100,000 per year range, which at least by some accounts might be considered kind of middle income or middle-ish income. But obviously there's this long tail on the right-hand side as well. So the natural question after that is then kind of how do those incomes compare to the population at large? The figure here shows the simplest version of that comparison. On the right-hand side, we show the median income of solar adopters, which was around 115K or so in 2020. And then on the far left, we show the median income of all US households, which was just a little bit over half that level. So pretty large difference when compared just to all US households. Part of that difference, of course, is related to home ownership. Homeowners tend to be wealthier, and most, if not, almost all behind the meter residential solar adopters are homeowners. And so when we kind of control for that, so to speak, by comparing just to incomes of all owner-occupied households, the difference is smaller. That's that middle bar there, though still there is pretty clearly a large difference. As I mentioned, California is kind of really impacts these national trends. California is a relatively high income state and represents a disproportionate share of all PV systems. And so part of this discrepancy here is also just kind of a California phenomenon. And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit further in the following slides. So one way that we control for some of these locational, regional differences in income levels is through this, what we call our relative income metric. And relative income is just the ratio or the ratio of solar adopter income to the median income of all households. And we can make this comparison at different geographical scales. And we can also compare to all households or just to owner-occupied households. And we do both of those things here. As we saw on the previous slide, the discrepancy between solar adopter incomes and the broader population is smaller when we compare just to owner-occupied households. Those are the dots in the figure here. As the figure also shows, the skew or the bias in income levels also declines the more localized the comparison. So as we go from comparing on the left-hand side to kind of national median incomes to, on the right-hand side, median incomes of just other households in the same tract or block group, those differences diminish, but they persist even at the smallest kind of most localized comparison here. You can see that solar adopters still do skew higher in terms of income. Here we show relative income levels broken out by state from highest to lowest. And really the main message here, I think, is that all states skew high. And interestingly, actually, that skew is particularly high in California. And I think one hypothesis for that is that home prices, home ownership costs in California are uniquely high, which kind of further exacerbates some of the income bias that we otherwise would see. More generally, the reason why these income bias levels can differ across states might relate to solar market maturity levels, what kinds of solar policies and programs are in place. Naeem and others on our team here recently published a paper in environmental research letters that kind of explored some of the factors that drive differences in income bias across locations, and explored a number of different socioeconomic factors, such as kind of general income inequality and cost of living differences across regions. So those are all potential drivers here. So far, we've really just kind of focused on a snapshot looking at 2020 adopters. The next couple slides will focus on how these trends have been changing over time. The figure here shows that solar adoption has been migrating, albeit somewhat slowly, towards less affluent households over time. And that's been happening both on an absolute basis, which is what the top line shows, as well as in terms of relative income levels, which is the bottom line. And that trend, that reflects a whole host of different factors. Certainly falling PV prices are a big part of that. Expanded availability of financing options are no doubt another key part, as well as the kind of more recent emergence of programs that are really focused on opening up solar markets to low and moderate income LMI households. Those kind of more fundamental drivers manifest in kind of two different ways. And we often talk about how solar markets are both broadening and deepening, and where broadening kind of refers to increasing adoption levels in areas of the country that are less affluent and previously haven't seen as much adoption, whereas deepening really refers to increasing levels of adoption of lower income households within existing markets, within established markets. And to some extent, both of those dynamics have been playing out. The relative income trend shown here is kind of a somewhat imperfect way of illustrating the deepening trend. And then on the next slide here, we show kind of how this broadening has manifest, at least at the state level. And to do that, we basically just divide all states into three different groups based on median state level incomes. So we've got kind of low income states, middle income, and high income states. And the figure here just simply shows the distribution of solar adopters across those three state groupings. And what you can see here is that since about 2016, there has been this fairly steady increase and movement in solar adoption towards lower and middle income states. A big part of that is relates to is due to Texas, which is among the middle income states, and Florida, which is among the low income states. Those two represent about half of that shift that we're seeing here. To be sure, high income states, those still represent the bulk of the market, about 60% in 2020. 2/3 of that, of course, is California. And just for reference, the US as a whole is roughly distributed evenly across these three groupings in terms of population levels. So if solar adoption were happening kind of equitably or in proportion, sort of in sort of proportion to the general population, we would see, these three groups would each represent 1/3 in contrast to the distribution that you see here. So this last slide here, I don't want to say a whole lot on this. It doesn't actually show anything fundamentally different than what we've already talked about. But what it does do is it kind of displays these trends in terms that are relevant to some of the programs and policies out there that are focused specifically on low to moderate income, or LMI households. Those programs often are focused on households with income below some threshold percentage of either federal poverty level, FPL, or area median income, AMI. And so all we've really done here is just show the breakdown of solar adopters into these different AMI and FPL based buckets. And the figure simply just shows that the percentage of solar adopters within those LMI groups has been increasing over time, and consistent with what we'd expect given some of the preceding trends. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Sydney. But before I do, I will just remind folks to enter any questions you might have into the Q&A box so that we can have hopefully a lively discussion at the end of the presentation. So Sydney, it's yours.
Great, thanks. So pivoting a little bit from Galen's discussion about overall income trends, we broke up that into different market segments. And again, I put in the chat, I'll put it again, the page for the report if you want to spend a little bit more time with the figures, because we're going to be running through quite a bit of these fairly quickly. So these are all different subsets of the data, with the exception of the multifamily versus single family homes, which is going to be the multifamilies in a separate data set. But all these other ones are subsets, and the sample sizes can be found in the report. So first we have third-party owned systems versus host-owned systems. If you could advance the slide, Galen. Thanks. So if you look on the left-hand axis with the two blue lines at the top, you can see that the solar adopter incomes for third-party owned systems are lower and also have declined faster over time. The couple implications here are that the general trend that Galen went over of the movement towards lower income solar adopters probably could be partially attributed to the expanded third-party ownership model. And you can see that with the orange line on the bottom and the right-hand axis. And so you also see here at the orange line, there has been a decline in third-party ownership finance systems since 2016. And this could also potentially dampen that trend towards lower incomes. And like Galen showed, there is sort of a flattening of that progression. The one other quick plug is that Eric led a study that found that third-party ownership model has actually driven additional adoption by lower income households. So that means that these are households that wouldn't have otherwise adopted. So a plug there. And again, the link is live in the report itself. So next slide, we talk about installer level trends. And so we have a bunch of different installers. So we first sectioned out just the installers that had at least 10 installations in 2020. And then we separated those further into large installers that installed over 1,000 systems in 2020, and then just the rest or other. And that is the yellow and gray respectively in both of these figures. So there is a small group of installers. If you look in that the top figure to the left of that dotted line. So there's a small group of installers that primarily serve lower income customers. And we did investigate, because there are so few, what was going on there. And a lot of these are actually, they serve low to moderate income customers as a core part of their business model. And so then if you look at the large installers, you see that there's only 19, again, compared to almost 1,000 of other installers, but they do make up a huge percentage of the market. And specifically when you're looking at the low to moderate income market, which is the bottom figure on the top, they account for over 57% of all of those systems installed in 2020. And this is roughly in line with their non-LMI market. But you do see that compared to the non-large installers or the other installers, they do have a slightly higher share in the LMI market. And this could be due to the fact that since they're larger, there's just more heterogeneity in terms of their offerings, things like third-party ownership available, et cetera. So moving along quickly to system size, and this is fairly intuitive, but essentially the takeaway here is that as you increase income, you see larger system sizes. And we broke out California from the other states just to show that this is true across all of the geographies for the most part. So this could be due to a couple things. It could just be because obviously larger systems cost more, so higher income equals more money to pay for a larger system. But you could also see things like if you have a higher income, you might have a house on a larger footprint with more usable rooftop space, or you could also have higher electricity consumption that you're trying to offset with your solar installation. So higher income, more money to spend on solar, higher electricity usage potentially, and larger roof area. So now moving to storage attachment. So this is a pretty small size of the market. So you see here that 7% of PV systems were paired with storage, and that's small, but it's increasing. It has been increasing and it will likely continue to do so in the future. So the way to interpret this figure is looking at the difference between the light and the dark gray. You can see the delta in the relative incomes, median relative incomes between those with attached storage and those with standalone solar. And then looking at, again, that dotted line, which is that county median. And so I'm not going to go over each state, but the one on the far left is just all of the sample. So what you can see here is that consistently across all geographies, for the most part, that the solar plus storage adopters do have consistently higher incomes than those with standalone solar. And again, that might make sense because, again, there is a price premium for storage and sometimes it doesn't pencil out economically. So again, you can see one thing that's interesting is the difference between those standalone solar and hybrid adopters is just that some of them are far more narrow. And in those states, that's primarily where the attachment rate is higher. And another thing that could impact that delta would be if there are, for example, state incentives that are specifically directed towards low to moderate income storage attachment. So next, and again, the multifamily data set is separate from the single family data set. So it's about 3% of all the data we got in 2020 was multifamily. So it's super small percentage wise. And this is also, again, rooftop solar. So most of these are owner occupied. And this is not like community solar subscriptions. This is just rooftop solar still. And the figure is formatted in the same way as the last one. And again, what you can see is across the board, but to different degrees, multifamily solar adopter incomes are generally very much below single family adopters, although again, there's variation state to state. And also one other difference between this and the battery slide is that you can see that dotted line. A lot of them, those the darker gray, it's actually closer to that dotted line. And in 4 of these states, it's actually below that dotted line. So this shows that in a few cases, the median multifamily adopter income actually falls well below the county median. So we don't have complete data on participation in income qualifying solar programs, but it does suggest that multifamily adopters do participate at higher rates than single family households. So that is pretty interesting and consistent with these data. So again, I'm moving quick, but the next 8 minutes, we're going to power through a bunch of these other socioeconomic trends listed on the next slide. And we are not going over things like age and home value, and we're really going to be breezing through a lot of them. So again, I encourage you to click on that report link if you want to spend a bit more time with any of the figures. But the first thing, before I dive into the first variable, is just that we can see similar trends with these other socioeconomic trends as with incomes. So the general story is kind of just that solar adopters differ from the broader population. The skew is diminishing over time, and it's flattened in recent years. And also, I'm going to say multiple times, but point out California compared to the US as a whole does also skew those national results. So Galen mentioned that one new thing we have this year is we had household level estimates for the householder for race, ethnicity, and you'll see later on for language. And these figures look very similar to last year's, because last year's report contained the data that we got for block groups from the American Community Survey. And what was interesting is when we looked at this year's household specific, so individual specific data compared to last year's block group data, we saw similar trends directionally, but even more so, I think, when we had the actual specific individual data. So what you can see here is the upper left means that the population is overrepresented, and each circle is a state, and the size is the size of the solar market. And then the bottom right signifies underrepresentation. So this is, again, high level, but what you can generally see is that the white and the Asian householders are generally overrepresented compared to their state populations, while Hispanic and Black householders are underrepresented relative to their state populations. There's a difference, obviously, with how far away from that dotted line and what side of the dotted line these circles fall on, but the two most consistent skews is strongest in the overrepresentation direction for Asian householders, and the underrepresented skew for Black householders. And so when we look again at the national trends, we pulled out California specifically, that bar on the far right, just because California really does differ compared to the overall US population. So when you do look at the national trends as opposed to the state trends in the last slide, you see that solar adopters are represented more by Asian and Hispanic householders, And again, California has really large Asian and Hispanic populations compared to the US. Less by Black householders, which is again similar with the state level trends. And it's actually fairly even or similar with white householders. And the one sort of temporal trend that we point out here is that over time there has been a decline in the white share of solar adopting householders, while there has been an increase in the Hispanic share of solar adopting householders. And so now we shift into language preference of the householder as well. And these figures are also formatted similarly. And so what's pretty interesting is that a lot of this is consistent with the race and ethnicity trends. However, there are some pretty interesting nuances. So you can see that householders that prefer English are overrepresented and those that prefer Spanish are underrepresented. But before, with race and ethnicity, those who were ethnically Asian or Pacific Islander were overrepresented. However, here, there's no real consistent trend. And so this actually points out something that we saw with both Asian Pacific Islander and Spanish-speaking householders, where you were essentially less likely to adopt solar if you are a non-English speaker. So if you prefer Asian Pacific Islander or Spanish language, more so than if you are ethnically Asian Pacific Islander or Hispanic. And so what that sort of indicates to us is that there is this additive impact of language preference over race and ethnicity. And this makes sense again with the literature of like marketing materials, et cetera, but it does have some impacts for things like how solar education awareness and peer effects, like a bunch of, again, additional questions that we don't really get into in this report. Similar with the national trends with race and ethnicity, California is very different, so we did pull that out, and it's important to keep in mind. But compared to the general US population, solar adopters have greater representation by Asian Pacific Islander and Spanish language householders. And again, in recent years, you see a decreasing share of English preference householders with an increasing share of Spanish language householders. So moving right along, so we looked as well for the rurality of these locations of these households. And you can see that at a state level, again, the bubble plot, similar format, but 22 states essentially fell on the upper left. So more rural, the adopters are more rural than their state population versus 18 states less rural than their state population. But overall, solar adoption is concentrated in less rural states in the US. So that has a big impact on what it looks like compared to all of the US, which is that inlaid figure there. So we pulled out again California because it's around half of our data, but the California population in rural areas is 5% compared to the US overall at 19%. So what ends up happening is that solar adoption is concentrated in less rural states, but within those states, it falls on both sides, but overall falls into more rural parts of their less rural state. And then the one note here and on the inlay as well is that the rural population has increased recently. And again, we think that is due to the expansion into more rural states. So the next couple I'm really just going to blaze through. And again, feel free to put in Q&A questions if I'm going too fast and if you want to spend more time with it. But so education level, this is fairly straightforward and consistent with last year's, but we do see that solar adopter education levels are generally higher than the population at large. And then again, similar to income, the skew is diminishing over time and has somewhat flattened in recent years. And so for the next slide, this is similar to occupation. If you sort of split all these up into business and financial occupations versus blue collar occupations, you see that the former is overrepresented, the latter is underrepresented. But again, that skew is diminishing over time with relative flattening in recent years. And finally, in here, but again, we talk about age and home value in the report itself. We have credit scores, and the caveat here is that due to data privacy issues, we just have zip +4 as opposed to the individual or the household actual credit score. And so zip +4 is a relatively small cluster of homes, but that means it could be impacted by things like high levels of home ownership in certain areas. And what we see here is that solar adopters skew towards these tight clusters with a disproportionately larger share of good, sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear the siren, I apologize, with higher credit scores and less so with lower. And so that takes us to the conclusions. So to wrap everything up, again, this is a descriptive analysis that is backwards looking, but solar adopters are heterogeneous in terms of their income and their other demographics. And even when you start segmenting them off into smaller market segments, and again, they diverge from the US population in a bunch of different ways. And there are these differences across states that could reflect differences in policies or resource or a bunch of other different factors. And again, the skew at that national level is diminishing over time and has somewhat flattened in recent years. And again, because this is a descriptive report of a huge data set, I'm about to pass it to our colleague Eric O'Shaughnessy to go over a tool, but we hope that these data can help inform further analysis and a bunch of interesting questions that these raise. And I also, again, I think I put a couple times in there the link to our site, because we actually also do a bunch of deep dives using these data and a bunch of other questions. So with that, I will pass it to Eric and encourage you all to put keep on putting stuff in the Q&A, which we'll get to after Eric. Thanks.
Okay, you're seeing my screen? I don't hear anything. So I'm Eric O'Shaughnessy, another member of this team, and I'm going to discuss this tool, if I can see it below my Zoom screen. So if you can navigate to this homepage, Solar Demographics Trends Analysis, it has links to this year's report, the tool that I'll discuss in a second, as well as a bunch of other publications down here. So this landing page has everything that we've done all in one convenient place. The tool itself, it's this interactive tool, and I've seen some questions in the Q&A that will probably get answered right now with this little quick tour. So the tool does a few things, not too much, it's manageable. So just to go through some of the basic functionalities, I'm not really going to discuss how to use it. There's actually a tutorial on YouTube, but I want to present mostly what you can do with this and the types of work and who might be interested in using it. So basically all of the data that goes into the report, it goes into this in some fashion. You can't get household level data out of this, but almost everything else aggregated you can. So just starting with this map, you can hover over, get different values. That's determined by what's down here in this bar. So the default is annual income, and you can just look at it, say Arizona, 59% of adopters in Arizona earn less than $100,000 per year. I'm just gonna explore around and see how different states perform. Or you can look at it, this is for the most recent year, 2020, or you can click and do a cumulative look. And here you can just see, for example, Louisiana pops out as a state that has a relatively large number of low-income adopters. Over here on the right is a graph that just breaks this down on the national level at the moment, or you can look at a time trend. And again, you can hover over and get specific values of everything. So down below, you can change the value that goes into the map. We can look at different metrics. So let's look at percent of area median income, and we see a slightly different output. But probably most importantly is the geographic level. So let's just select state. And then it's going to prompt me to select a state. So let's look at Louisiana, because Louisiana looks interesting. I can click on Louisiana and I see these specific trends, Louisiana here, or this distribution. Also, we can go to county. So we can zoom in and pick some county. This yellow one here looks interesting. So check this one out, and same thing. It automatically updates. And this is a good example. So some counties don't have enough data, it just tells you so. But San Bernardino, for example, does have. So that's what you can do within the tool, and everything basically you see here can be downloaded. I can download the data that's going into this. The download tab updates based on what you've selected. So right now, because I've selected San Bernardino County, I can download the data, or I can just download the data for all counties. If I wanted to, for example, do it for state, I can come back here and select Arizona. Now I can download data for Arizona or for all states. I can download images of the map. The selection here, maybe there's so many people going on to it just caused a quick crash. We'll reload. So I can download the map. I can download a selection of the map, meaning if I zoom in here, it'll download that. And I can download these plots over here. And then one key detail right here is tract level data. So this is the only place you can get tract level data within the landing page. It's a pretty big file, 90 megabytes. It takes a few seconds to download, but click there and you can get it. So again, here's where you can find all the data, a few notes here. But hopefully that gives you a sense of what you can do with this. There's some questions in the Q&A. You certainly can come to the tool. The tool is the best place if you want to get state level data, county level data, and then tract level data. So that's the tool. And with that, I think it goes to Naeem to DJ the Q&A.
Hi there, thanks so much. And thanks all the presenters, Sydney, Galen, and Eric. We do have some questions that have come up. So let's go through them. Some have been addressed, but maybe we want to clarify. So there are a couple of questions on data. And so maybe describing a little bit more on what data is available for download. So what is in that tract level file that you pointed out, Eric? The question in this case is, is there granular data on racial trends by state? Do you provide a list of the 19 large installers that Sydney was referring to as being responsible for 57% of all installations? Is that part of the data? And yeah, so let's start with a little bit deeper dive into what's available for download.
Do you want to take the tool part of that question, Eric? And I
sure.
Can pick up from there.
So on the tool, the data you can download is what is presented in the tool. So everything is broken down into specific bins. So the tract level data is, for example, the percent of adopters in those different bins, less than 60,000 per year, 60 to 80, 80 to 100, something like that. So basically, when you go to the tool, it should be relatively intuitive what you're going to get by looking at the plots and the figure.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify that, our data set consists of, maybe around 2 million records, 2.3 million records, something like that. And we unfortunately can't share kind of the individual address level data. That's information that we obtain under confidentiality agreements. But so what we've done is with this tool, we've tried to sort of roll it up and aggregate it in a way that is shareable. And at this point, really the most granular that it gets is kind of tract level totals and breakdowns.
But the tool only deals with the income variables, so I think it still would be shareable things like the other demographics at a state level. But those aren't available for download on the tool, and you'd probably have to just contact one of us.
Yeah.
But the level of aggregation is fine. State level is fine.
Yep. And if there are particular figures that anybody just wants the numbers that are underlying, that are being plotted in that figure, we're happy to share that as well. That's not something that we've posted, but we have the data tables that are being plotted in those figures. So those are easy to share if people are interested in them.
Yeah, I don't know the answer of if we are allowed to share the largest installers. I think that those are probably it might be even Googleable. I don't know, just like the installers that probably advertise the most and are in the most states. But I'm not sure if that's something that we're able to share.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of questions on underlying trends. So one of them is whether we have a hypothesis as to why solar adoption rates are falling among those higher income groups over 100,000. So we can start with that.
So, I mean, I guess I would clarify that I'm not sure that adoption rates in an absolute sense are falling among that population. It's just that the share of total solar adoption consisting of that income share is shrinking. So in other words, you know, other income groups are representing larger and larger shares of the total. That doesn't mean that, you know, high income households are adopting less solar now than they used to be. I'm pretty sure adoption levels within all income groups are going up. It's just that they're going up faster within lower income groups than within higher income groups.
Great. And another kind of trends question is around this broadening versus deepening of the market. So do we know if the broadening into LMI states is still dominated by similarly higher income adopters? So in other words, does this broadening suggest adoption by LMI households, or does it suggest increased adoption by higher income people in LMI states?
Eric, this seems like a question up your alley.
Yeah, so that's kind of why we like to use broadening versus deepening. Broadening, all else equal, what we want to say by that concept is moving geographically, but you would think just intuitively, as you broaden out, solar is going to have that skew anywhere it is. So as it moves into a relatively low income area, I think you're kind of framing it with that hypothesis, I think is correct, that it's going to begin with relatively high income households. So the reason that broadening is quite effective, though, is that once you move into a new area, maybe the high income households in the area are already relatively lower income than the high income. So if you're moving from Beverly Hills to further into central Los Angeles, as an example, high income households are going to earn a bit less than relatively affluent households elsewhere. And then because of social influence, you'd expect it to expand within that area. So it's going to eventually trickle down. Kind of don't like to use that analogy, but to lower income households within that area. But I think that the way you framed the question, I think we would agree with that assessment.
A question that maybe Eric, your appropriate answer here too is, do you have any insights into how availability of financing affects adoption? And I'm guessing LMI adoption in particular.
Sure. So Sydney mentioned a study that we did. Access to financing in general, very well established around 2011, 2012, when financing became a big picture that really expanded the market, just writ large, not with respect to income. As financing has become less prevalent in the market, it's become very clear that low-income households rely on financing a lot more. So as long as there's access to financing, it's going to buoy the low-income market. It's going to sustain the low-income market. So as Sydney mentioned, there's a link to the study, or the study is linked on the landing page. You can go look, and we do some research essentially showing the role of financing in supporting low-income adoption.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So there are a few specific questions. Any correlation between minority women-owned installers and those who serve LMI populations? I guess answer that is we don't have information on whether the installers themselves are minority or women-owned, we would need some kind of data set to be able to determine whether each of these installers, and we do have hundreds of installers, maybe thousands throughout the country. So such a data set would definitely be difficult to put together. So there are a few questions on.
I was also going to plug if you know of a way to do that, feel free to reach out. And also to answer the second part of that question, because you asked about the low to moderate income specific adopters. So those that make it part of their core mission to serve those populations. I think that was difficult, and that was something we went back and forth on, because we know of a few that definitely do that, but we're not necessarily sure if that list is exhaustive. Like, I think there's probably smaller installers that do that we're just not sure of. So the way we were doing it before, which wasn't as rigorous as we were hoping, is almost to work backwards, like figure out which were serving that population, and then kind of like figure out, reverse engineer their core mission, which is not necessarily, like, again, going to be as comprehensive as possible. But for the ones that we're aware of, we did find that they do serve the low to moderate income population in general better than the ones that don't have it as their core mission. But that's anecdotal, I guess.
Great. And it looks like we may have a follow-up to get data on women or minority-owned installers. So we'll definitely follow up with you.
Yes, thank you.
So one question is, did we draw any correlations between system price and LMI adoption? And this especially is interesting given the 2021 report, where we do see price increases over the second half of the year.
So we have not, within this study, looked at sort of, we haven't done any kind of econometric analysis within this annual report. So this is all just sort of descriptive stuff. In prior work, however, we have looked at the relationship between system price and income levels of the homeowners. And I mean, this was a study that we did back in maybe 2014. So remains to be seen whether the same relationships remain today. But what we found then is actually higher income households tended to pay more for PV. And I think our hypothesis at the time was partly that for higher income households, the information search costs associated with kind of finding the lowest cost provider, those search costs were relatively high. And so that tended to lead to higher installed system prices for higher income customers. But I think it's an interesting question. I think, Eric, you've done maybe a little bit of work. I don't know if any of it has been published in recent years, kind of looking at kind of pricing for LMI households.
Well, the two things I would say is we did one study with quote data, and there we didn't really find any difference in prices based on income level. And the second one was Naeem's paper that was plugged earlier in Environmental Research Letters, where the finding there was basically that price didn't have a big effect on differences in income adoption. And the way we sort of explained that was now in 2022, prices have reached a point where there's not that big of a difference between, it's not a question of thousands of dollars between an expensive system and a relatively inexpensive system. So prices, as they've come down, are probably less of a factor in determining whether or not a low-income household. It's other factors such as structural issues, access to financing, a lot of other factors play in other than price as prices come down.
Great. So a question, do we have any insights around how federal ITC eligibility impacts uptake for LMI adopters? adoption?
Well, does the federal ITC have a carve out for income eligible adopters, or is it just impacts any system? So I suppose it impacts the whole population. So I think it'd be, I'm not sure. I maybe don't understand the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps the question here has to do with kind of having enough of a tax basis or tax appetite to absorb the credit. And yeah, I mean, within the literature, that's, you know, kind of one of the established kind of barriers and issues, and is often one of the reasons why people argue for reforming the tax credit into sort of some sort of direct payment. But I think that's also one reason why third-party ownership structures have been more strongly adopted by lower income households, is because in those cases, the third-party system owner, they're the one who absorbs the tax credit. And so I think that's you know, one of the reasons why financing can be particularly important for lower income households.
And out of scope for this work, but community solar also usually deals with that by usually having some sort of like community backstop or someone with tax appetite for the other subscribers. So again, out of scope here, but I think that's definitely, yeah, definitely important.
Great. So there was a question asking about, is there a way to view adoption rates by race or language preference at the census tract level, or is that only available at the national level?
I mean, it's certainly possible within our data set. Yeah, I mean, we haven't sort of tabulated the data in terms of adoption rates, which, I mean, in my mind, at least, I think of as being kind of like the percentage of the population adopting. But that's certainly is directly doable with the data that we have.
Great. A few more here. Do you have any demographic data that lower FICO or FICO households trend towards community solar? And what about square footage of house or other versus solar adopters? So I guess just generally, I can answer that our data set does not include community solar. So we don't have kind of information. In fact, there was another question about community solar. So that's to answer that, is that our data doesn't include community solar. In terms of square footage of a house, maybe we can answer kind of questions about house characteristics.
Well, we do have some research in the works for looking at energy burden, and that does deal with some property characteristics like the size of the household, the heating fuel type, etc. So that's upcoming work. We sort of just got access to property information, so we have not integrated it yet, but we're in the process of doing that. Maybe next time.
Okay, so there are a few very specific questions. We will get back to those individually, but I don't see any question. Oh, so there's one that just came in on, are we going to be expanding to cover both standalone energy storage as well as storage pairing with solar in the future?
I don't think we have any immediate plans to do that. I mean, I think within the residential sphere, at least, the kind of amount, the number of standalone storage systems are pretty small at present. But to the, you know, we have, you know, we'll be getting that data as it kind of comes in and materializes, and so I think if we can get to sort of a critical mass of the market where it makes sense to really dig in, then we would do so.
Okay, and we're at
There were two questions on, this is a really quick answer, but there are two questions on time of use rates versus flat rates. And I just wanted to say that we don't have the rate structures that these households are under. So I think that would require some assumptions or thoughts on methodology to figure that out. But no, we don't have any information on rates.
And with that, we're at the top of the hour. Just a quick answer to a question about the recording. The recording will be up on the landing page of the report, so everyone will be able to get the recording of this webinar.
And again, that's solardemographics.lbl.gov, all one word. Great. All right. Well, I guess I can close things out here. So thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate your time and your questions here. Of course, if any other questions come to mind, feel free to shoot any of us an email. And otherwise, we will just look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks very much.